I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and it is my great good fortune to be sharing a stage tonight with Jay Ellis.
Hello.
Who was part of, was part of a pop culture moment, a pretty significant one. I was not the only person who has watched Insecure at 10,000 times and had lots of feelings about Lawrence.
Yep. I can't wait to hear those feelings.
They're all good, actually.
Okay.
I mean, I'm just excited that my 20s are over. That's how I finished that rewatch. I was like, I'm really glad my 20s are over. And obviously, there have been some other pieces as well that you've done. There's that little Tom Cruise movie from, what, a year ago?
It's an indie. It's called Top Gun Maverick.
Right,
It's an indie.
right.
Not a lot of people know about it, so I'm still introducing it to
lots
people.
of giant planes and, stuff like that. But more importantly, you've been an actor for how long? Like a working actor?
13, 14 years, maybe now.
But you've been a lifelong reader, right?
A lifelong reader.
Okay. We started with Dr. Seuss and Green Eggs and Ham, right?
Yes, we did.
Okay. So lifelong reader, actor for almost 20 years. You never planned on writing a book, and yet here we are.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk about this for a second because you have said this is not a memoir.
Yeah. Not a memoir.
Not a memoir.
I haven't lived enough life for a memoir. I feel like when you write a memoir, you got to be like, I don't know, in your 70s or 80s.
No.
You don't think so?
No. I've been a bookseller for a really long time.
I know, but it just feels like you want to have a lot of stuff. You want to remember the decades.
All right.
I failed that quiz, clearly.
No, because here's the thing, and you're doing a lot of things in the book. It's a little bit of memoir. It's a little bit of you thinking through your creativity, you thinking through how you approach your larger body of work.
Right.
It's you looking at your family. There's a lot of love in this book.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I never got to meet your grandparents. I really feel bummed that I didn't. I've met them on the page. They're great on the page, but I'm bummed that I did not get to meet them. So let's talk about when this book started for you, because really, you've been really clear, totally clear. I was not planning on ever writing a book.
Yeah, I think I found myself in the pandemic and, I burned some bread. I did all the Instagram things. I burned bread and then I was like, I'm going to learn a language. Let me download 5 different apps to learn Spanish, and I didn't learn anything. At least nothing stuck. But I found myself at my mom's house with looking through all these pictures. She has pictures on both sides of our family, and I was looking at all these childhood pictures, and kind of memories just started flashing back. And really, I kind of started just writing stories.
Okay.
I just wanted to write stories kind of to remember like some of the places I lived, some of the people who were in my life, to then hopefully be able to share those stories one day with my own kids.
Yeah.
And I found that the stories were just getting longer and longer, and then another story would pop up, and then I'd call my mom and ask her about something, and then my grandma and ask her about something, and then all of a sudden I looked up and I'd had 10 stories that I had written, and I was like, oh, maybe there's something here. And I sent it over to someone that I work with, and they sent it over to my book agent over at UTA, where I'm represented as an actor.
Okay, Albert Lee.
Albert Lee
is one of the best
Shout
dudes
out.
We have to stop for 2 seconds because
Shout
I
out
love
to
that
Albert
dude.
Lee.
I love that dude.
He's a good one. And Albert calls me. He's like, I read what you wrote. And I go, oh, yeah, thanks, great. And he goes, you have no idea what you're doing, do you? And I was like, no, but that's why you're here, book agent. Tell me what to do. And he was like, I really think you have something special here. And I'm going to help you. I want to help you figure this out because I really do think you have something special. So then he taught me how to do a book proposal, and he taught me how to he taught me that whole process that was so foreign to me because it's not what I do. I'm used to getting some material and, deciding if I am going to audition for it or not, and then saying no, and then my team talking me into auditioning for it, and then I book it and it changes my life. But that's what I'm used to doing. So this was a completely foreign process. Yeah. And then all of a sudden I was writing a book.
Yeah. Okay. So I learn about Jay's book when I'm having lunch with your editor, who I'm quite fond of. Nicole, we're going to shout out Nicole Counts as well. And she said, I've got this thing that I'm doing with, the guy who played Lawrence. And I said, okay, just send it to me. And then I start reading and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, he's funny, but also there's more here than just jokes. Because at first I was like, okay, great, invisible friend, what are we getting into? I did not have an invisible friend as a child. I had a little brother, and he followed me everywhere. Now he's bigger than I am, but at the time, every photo, tiny person shouted. So I didn't need an invisible friend.
Yeah.
But you take a moment at the beginning of the book, and you start talking about how you ended up sort of creating Mikey.
Yeah.
And we're in Los Angeles, so we are not going to ignore the Haley Joel Osment part of the story. Or the Dwayne Wade, or the Will Smith part. So can we talk about how Mikey showed up?
We were living in Tampa, Florida at the time, and my dad bought a TV out of a guy's trunk in a parking lot. And this is back when TVs had like a booty on the back of them. Like they were,
I remember those.
This was back then.
They were ginormous.
They were huge. And then remember we used to get one, it would be like a floor model TV, and you couldn't, it would just sit there. Like the TV wouldn't work for years, but it would just sit there and like become a table basically. Anyway, so my dad he buys this book out of this guy's trunk in Tampa, Florida. And when he buys it, he opens up the front of the box and he shows it to him. And the screen is there with the casing for the television. And when we get home, my dad opens the box and he goes to take the TV out, and just the screen comes out, and the box is filled with bricks. So now my dad is trying to convince my mom that he should go out in the streets of Tampa in the middle of the night and find this guy to beat him up for selling him this box of bricks. And my mom is like, no, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. What's wrong with you? You have a son, or you're just going to drive around Tampa all night? Anyway, it's Tampa. There's a storm, as Tampa does. Lightning and thunder. And in kind of the confusion of the night, my imagination just kind of took over, and I thought that my room had become a swamp and that there were alligators circling around my bed. Right. And I was too afraid to get out of bed and run to my parents' room. And so
But you were little, too.
I was little.
You were, what, 6, 7?
I was 5.
Okay. You were little.
I was little. And Mikey just pops over my shoulder, my imaginary friend, and he's like, oh, we ain't about to be no Crocs dinner. And from that moment, I just remember him being there, and with some help, by the way, because I've asked, my mom and my grandma and my dad about stories. But, like, when I started to, like, kind of unpack and open up the boxes of my childhood in that time, like, he was there.
Right.
And, going through this process, what I ultimately learned is that he was there to kind of help me process a time that was very chaotic. And I was moving around a ton, and I was an only child, so I was doing it alone. And then also, all the mixed messaging that we were getting from media at the time, from television shows, from reality shows, from 24-hour news networks, stuff that didn't exist earlier started to become a boom at this time.
I mean, you were born in 81.
Yep.
Just in time for lots of really excellent stuff to happen. Oh, man. So much good stuff.
What a time.
And you start riffing, and I think you open with Reaganomics, and I think we end up with Wu-Tang Clan. And it's one of the best. I really go find it in the book. I promise you, it is one of the best riffs, and it just captures 2 decades of American stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm a tiny bit older than you, but not so much older that I'm walking around with my chair and everything else. But you're exactly right when you say it was chaos. Like, our parents didn't really quite understand what was happening around them. There was weird stuff happening with the economy. There was stuff happening socially. I mean, AIDS had just come onto the scene. Like, there was so much going on, and some of our parents didn't quite know how to handle it.
The language wasn't there.
The language was totally not there.
And they grew up in a time where everything was, like, quote unquote safe.
Yeah.
Right? Like, more controlled. We didn't have as many options to know what else was out there. Like, news was being spread. It's so wild to think that you had to know what happened yesterday when you read it in the paper this morning.
Right.
How crazy is that? Like, that's how our parents grew up. Like, they didn't know, or you didn't know what happened internationally until, like, the Sunday evening news.
Right.
Like, it's so wild to think that. And now it's, like, at our fingertips.
I never really thought I'd be walking around with a supercomputer in my pocket. Like, I remember my brother, actually, when we were little, we had an uncle who was an actual rocket scientist. So he had one of those handsets, and you would puld the phone in it, and you would dial into the internet. Only occasionally he would be hogging the phone when I needed it, and I may have disconnected him at inopportune moments, and someday I will pay for that. Just the technology was so wildly different. I'm being beyond the televisions that turned into furniture or had those giant backs or anything like that. But you're also an only child.
Yeah.
Your parents were pretty young when you showed up.
Yeah. Teenagers.
And
they were babies.
Yeah, babies.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember being a teenager, and I'm really impressed.
I am too.
I'm really impressed that they were able to do this. But your dad was in the Air Force?
Yeah. My dad was in the Air Force, and my parents, both their fathers were in the Air Force, so they grew up in the Air Force as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which means moving around a lot. You did 12 schools in 13 years?
Yeah.
At exactly the right moment when you really want to be doing that stuff. Oh, that must have been awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, you're asking your mom and your grandma to fill in some gaps, but there's also some pretty formative stuff that even if you didn't write it down, you don't necessarily shake.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I tell people all the time, like, I feel like if compartmentalization was a event at the Olympics, I would be the most gold-winning Olympian of all time. And I think some of it has to do with from moving around. I think some of it has to do from the time that I grew up in. But to your point, all of it is still there.
Yeah.
You know, once you start to open up some of those boxes, like all those memories really do start to kind of flood back. And while to your point, like I did ask my dad and my mom and my grandmas to help fill in some of the gaps, like even the things that they would give me were enhancing the thing that I kind of already knew, right? Because they had more awareness of the time that we were in. In the process of writing this book, it was wild to kind of replay and relive some of those memories.
And there are rules for engagement with invisible friends. Just because you had one doesn't mean you saw someone else.
Doesn't mean everybody else got one.
No.
Doesn't mean I can see yours.
No, all of this. It was something, Mikey was a device for you to work on your own creativity.
Yeah.
He was a device for you to feel less lonely. I mean, loneliness is something that we don't, even now, right? Like, it's the 21st century, and we still have trouble as a society talking about loneliness and what it does. And you see this isolation, and you see people really struggling in ways. So, I mean, if a kid can come up with a means for taking care of himself, then maybe we're on to something, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I kind of learned in writing the book is that, like, our childhood mind gives us what we need.
Yeah.
Our childhood imagination gives us the thing that we need when we need it, whether that's companionship, whether that's to protect us, whether that's to process something. Like, that's kind of what kids' brains do. And we lose it along the way to some degree, or it becomes something different, I guess, as you get older, but it's still there inside of us at the end of the day. It took some work to figure that out.
Okay, but I would assume, too, though, that creativity carries over into the day job as well, though, that you're able to take some of what you've learned from your acting process and take what you've learned from the writing process, because they're not necessarily the same set of muscles, and use them to feed each other.
They're definitely not the same set of muscles. I thought I was going to cruise into writing a book. I thought it was going to be the easiest thing ever. Writing is really hard. It is really, really, really hard. And speaking of, like, back to, like, isolation, again, also, like, trying to do it by yourself in a bubble. Yeah. But I do think there are some things, like I talk about in the book, like, I moved around so much that every school I went to, if I didn't like how I was perceived or how the persona that I put on at the previous school, if I didn't like how it played out or how it worked, then I would get to a new school and I would be a completely different character at this new school. And, like, fast forward, obviously I fall in love with acting and I'm able to understand more of what it is and put a name to it and work towards it.
Yeah.
But really, I was doing a version of it when I was a kid, and we all were to some degree, but, like, I was doing a version of it when I was a kid. I just didn't know it at the time.
Right.
I think one of the things that's the most fun is I get to take people that I've met in my life and kind of draw from them and put into a character that I get to go create for television and film. And, like, that to me has been a lot of fun, where I go, like, oh, I know this guy, or I know a guy like this. I'm just going to take a little bit of what I remember about this person and put it into this character that I'm now Lawrence from Insecure is actually a perfect example of that.
Okay.
Like that was an amalgamation of like two really good friends of mine, one from college and one from high school, who I think kind of were on a similar journey to some degree.
Okay.
And then I got to mix in my own
Right.
process, my own journey into that process as well.
I'm waiting for a little more Grandpa Booker and a little more Grandpa James. And when you read the book, you will understand what I'm talking about, but I'm really kind of bummed. I had very different grandfathers than you did, but I think yours sounded like a lot of fun, but also like clearly loving and clearly doing what they could with what they had. And, this is something we talk a lot about representation, right, in the arts. We talk about it whether it's film or music or television and certainly books. I mean, we've been having an sort of ongoing conversation. It feels like a new conversation to some people, but it really is a conversation we've been having in books for a really, really long time, and we don't always succeed. But, what does representation really look like? Like, who gets to determine what representation actually is? And this is something you've talked about in other interviews where you have an opportunity to change the way we tell stories about Black men.
Yeah.
And it's so hugely important. But then we also need like Deacon King Kong and, James McBride's novel set in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which is similar in the amount of love that you see, right? But there are some dudes in that book that remind me of Grandpa Booker and Grandpa James. And I would like to see them represented. I would like to see your dad and your mom and your grandma and your cousins, right? Like, but who determines what representation is?
It's interesting. I think clearly not the folks looking to be seen.
Right.
It's interesting that you bring up my grandfathers because I don't know that I thought about the love that either of them had.
Right.
Or displayed or gave. I think I actually thought of both of them as like no nonsense. Air Force,
right.
my way or the highway.
Right.
I joked that my grandpa Booker, when we would take these road trips as kids, I joked that like he ran the minivan, kind of like Jerry Jones runs the Dallas Cowboys. Like he just didn't care about anybody's opinion at all, ever. And he would put you out at any point too. But there was, for what he had, for what he knew, he was actually full of love. Yeah. Like him cutting my hair was his way of giving me love, him making me like tuck my like Sunday shirt into my underwear. so it wouldn't like lift up when we were in church. Like that was his way of showing love. He just didn't know how to necessarily put words to it. And same thing with my other Grandpa James. Like he wanted to hang out with me and he wanted to spend time. And so when my mom would drop me off over there, he didn't know what to do with a kid though.
Right.
So he was like, all right, I'll do the thing that I love. And that's how I will show you that I love you when I spend time with you. And for him, that meant driving to truck stops on the edge of town. It was it
was an adventure.
It was an adventure, yeah. But it was cool. Yeah. And again, like, I got to kind of look back at them and understand them for who they are.
Right.
And what they had for the time they were in.
I mean, that distance that you get, right, when you have to sit with what you've put on the page.
Yeah.
And there are very, very few people who turn in a clean draft like that, right? Like it just, you know this now.
I did not.
You know this now.
I did not. If I got one more email with some notes, thoughts, and ideas, I was like, this process is over. I'm not doing this anymore.
But here's the thing. Now we have this.
Right.
Sometimes you don't get the perfect mix of length and idea or sentence. Like we get all of it with you. Right, we get the story, we get the nice sentences, because I get really distracted. If I get a clunky sentence, I get ripped out of a story very quickly. And whatever you need to read, there's a book out there for everyone. I absolutely believe that there's a book out there that will make your heart swing. I need sentences, though, that are really, really good. I don't necessarily need stuff to happen, but I have a really clear arc for you as a tiny person, you as an adolescent, and you as a young man.
Yeah.
And that's why you don't get to say this isn't a memoir. Yeah, I get that it's built around vignettes, but it is still a memoir because there is an actual narrative arc. There is.
Right.
You did some heavy lifting to get here. And part of it is using humor.
Yeah.
Sousaphones are inherently funny. I don't care what anyone says. They're funny. The word is funny. I need you to imagine this guy as an adolescent walking around with a giant sousaphone.
That probably weighed more than me.
Yeah, probably. My brother plays the bari sax, and he started playing it when he was like 13, and the sax was bigger than him. It was hysterical. But, you know, we need that humor. We need Uncle James driving you at all the truck stops. And your mom has a couple of moments where she lets a couple of lines go where I'm like, your mom could be Asian. Totally could be Asian. Your dad has some lines. But also, you don't leave out the serious stuff. There is, and we're going to be a little spoiler-free in this conversation because I had the pleasure of reading this book straight through and not having anyone interrupt for me. But there is some serious stuff. Your cousin Carter goes through some stuff. You have another cousin who dies early. You have way too many stories about being stopped by the police.
Yeah.
We need to have both sides, right? We need to have all of the pieces of the conversation. And they need to be told by the person who's actually experiencing it, right?
Yeah.
But that's a lot to process when you're also writing about Mikey.
Right.
And that really mean kid that your mom tried to make you be friends with. That guy was bad.
Yeah, he was horrible.
Some kids are just
He grew up
bad,
to be
I'm
a very nice human, apparently.
Okay, well, that's great. Congratulations.
Apparently he's a very nice guy today. But yeah, at the time he was...
He's not nice in that
Nah,
story.
he was rough. But no, I think it's interesting because life is full of all of it.
Right.
Like, I think life is full of the funny and the serious and the, you know, in some of the darkest moments, some silly things happen or someone says something funny and it just gives you a moment of levity. And sometimes, you know, the most, you know, unexpected things happen right before like you're about to go have an amazing night or amazing day. You know, I think that's just part of life. It's full of ups and downs. And like for me, you know, I didn't set out to write a book that was full of traumatic stories.
Right.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But
Right.
that's not the book that I wanted to write. But even to tell some of the stories of joy or happiness or imagination or creativity, I felt like I still had to honor some of the other moments that happened around them to, for myself, even understand why I then went to those moments of imagination. Right. As my way of trying to process some of these moments that were heavier. And that's just life. That's part of what we do. It's not until we get older, really, that we just sit in it, you know.
I think when we have the luxury of looking back on certain moments and you just kind of go, wow, I did actually get to the other side of that.
Yeah.
And to be able to become the kind of adult that maybe you needed when you were small. You know, our elders did what they could with what they had, right?
Yeah.
And some of them were not fully equipped. You know, we knew they loved us, but sometimes you were like, I'm sorry, what planet are you from? I know you think I'm the one who's from Mars, but I beg to differ. I think we have a miscommunication here. I am going to use that, though, to jump to a couple of audience questions. How young were you when you began getting told to man up, and who was curtailing your boyhood?
Oh, man. That message happened so young.
Yeah.
I think we don't even realize it happened so young. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and there's so many times where I've been like, you're going to be a big girl? At 2, you're going to be a big girl? Well, the other big girls are doing it. And why am I taking her out of being her 2-year-old self?
Right.
I think it happens way younger.
Right.
And in far more innocent ways than what we even imagine. And so then we all end up on this kind of trajectory to grow up fast.
Yeah.
And be grown and be the big kid and be the big man or the big girl or whatever it may be. I grew up as the baby cousin.
How many cousins?
In a family, there was about 13 or 14 of us in Stockton alone.
Okay, so you're the little duckling following everyone behind.
And they were all girls. And so I just wanted to, they would always be like, you got to man up. You got to be big. And I don't blame them for it. But I also think that like there was this funny thing of like, I wanted it because I didn't want them to like, I didn't want to be the little one of this group. Like I didn't want them to be ahead of me. I didn't want them to be smarter than me. I didn't want any of that. So I just was like, I'm gonna grow up. I'm not a little boy. I'm a man. You ain't a man. I am a man. I think that becomes
okay. But what's the age range between you and the cousins? Like what's the oldest cousin is how much older than you?
So the oldest is probably 11 years older.
Okay. That's a big
11
Okay.
years older, maybe even 12, and then all the way down to 1 year older.
Okay.
All girls.
Yeah, you were totally outnumbered.
All
you were
girls.
so outnumbered.
And then the next one after me actually was a little boy.
Okay.
Which is pretty wild. But yeah, I think it happens a lot earlier than what we think. And I think as far as like curtailing my childhood, I don't really think of like my family necessarily or anyone who was around me necessarily as much as I think of the messaging I was getting from the media at the time.
Right.
Like that to me, I think was the thing where I was like, oh, I'm that, or that's what I'm supposed to be, or that's what the statistic says.
Yeah.
I think that's more of where I'm like, it wasn't necessarily what my neighborhood looked like.
Right.
It wasn't what my friend group looked like, but that's what TV was saying at the time.
It's so wild to me that we still really haven't figured out how to talk about masculinity in a way that's productive for men and boys.
What masculinity?
Yeah, right?
What? Yeah.
Right? Like, it's okay to cry. Like, we're still having to say, no, really, you should cry. That's normal. And I say this as a half Japanese Bostonian. Like, that's not a baseline setting for me either. But if I can actually learn to do it, I promise you, dudes, you can learn too. No, really. Seriously, I swear. But yeah, even now, it's just, can't we get a little further ahead in this conversation? Like, I feel like we're just treading water in a lot of ways. And I'm like, but we know so much more.
But do you think it happens when you get older? Because I will say this, like, I feel like my friend group, we're all like, I love you, man. And we never said that before. Like, I feel like I feel like we're like, hey, how you doing? We're just checking in. How you good?
Okay.
But how's your spirit? Like, you good? Like, I think that's happening more. I mean, my actor friends is a completely different thing because we're all like, oh my God, did you see it? I mean, Bing Bong came back. So that's a completely different thing. But I do feel like for some of my friends who may not be in the arts,
Right.
I feel like there is this thing where, and maybe it's because they have kids, so maybe they're like speaking to their kids in a different way now, and the language that they've learned in terms of communicating with their kids has now helped them learn to kind of deal with some of the stuff. I do feel like it's, I don't know, I feel like I can now like watch a football game with a friend of mine, and he can also tell me that like, man, I'm going through it.
Okay.
Not all the time. Some you still got to pull it out of them, but
I'll
I think
take
like
the progress. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm good at progress. How's your dad doing?
Speaking of a dude who cries all the time,
Seriously?
man, this dude went from like being an action figure to being like, I love you, man. Like the exact, like again, like another to me example of like progress.
Yeah.
It's a total example of progress. My dad is great. He's like one of my best friends, man. He's awesome. He's fun. He's being in a movie like Top Gun and growing up in the Air Force and the two of those things coming together and him getting to, like, he was blown away at that and like literally cried at the premiere of the movie. But then also like to now have grandkids and like to see him on the ground rolling around with grandkids and like it's really cool. It is not the same dad I grew up with, but and again he was a baby.
Right.
But it's so cool to see that like he's had this journey and who the man that he's become. Like, it's weird. I grew up with my parents. You know what I mean? Like literally. But it's cool to see like the progression that he's had.
So in your chapter, Young Love, you mentioned trial and error through relationships, but each taught you to keep trying. How did that tenacity evolve as you grew older?
I don't know. I think rejection just became like, yeah, it's all right. I'll find when I'm supposed to find it. There's 8 billion people on the planet, so there has to be somebody for everybody.
Right.
Unless you don't want nobody.
Right.
And maybe even if you don't want nobody, there still might be somebody out there for you. I don't know. I just felt like what's the worst that could happen is you could be told no. So you might as well try.
Yeah.
It'd be better to try and no than to not try and maybe miss an absolutely amazing person in your life.
I like to say yes when I feel like I should say no. Because I'm just like, really, there are times where you want to go home and just stare at a wall. And it's like, no, I really should just go do the thing. And it's when I go do the thing that really cool stuff happens.
Always.
And it's just, okay, like, this was not the plan. But I'm also not a planner.
Okay.
I'm actually not. I'm just kind of like, let's see what happens.
I love that. But you could do that. This because you live in New York. You could do that when you live in New York.
This is true.
You just walk outside and life just happens.
Kind of.
Yeah, that's the whole different. Yeah.
It kind of does.
Yeah.
It has a lot to recommend it. I do want to talk about other influences for a second because Hanif Abdurraqib, who's a writer I love this dude.
Hanif.
So he calls Jay's book joyous, celebratory, fluorescent, and fully alive, and the man is not lying. And I really love Hanif. So clearly his stuff has been an influence on you. I think Issa's book as well has been an influence. But lifelong reader.
Yeah.
Is there a little R.L. Stein in there too?
Oh,
I mean,
man.
you were a library kid, fellow library kid to fellow library kid.
I love being scared. I love being afraid.
Okay, so let's talk about these influences.
I think I was just in the library and just wanted something to read.
Okay, fair.
To be honest,
totally
I think it was. I don't even know that I was necessarily introduced to R.L. Stein. I think it maybe.
Okay.
Not to say that I wasn't, but I think that there was this library that I used to go to in South Tulsa that was across from the mall. And I would tell my mom I was going to the mall, but I would really sneak off to the library. And I would literally just go sit in the library. And they have they still have them, like the study rooms in most libraries. And I would like grab like 4 or 5 books and I would sit in one of the study rooms for an entire day and just go from like, I'd read a chapter of one book and then I'd read a chapter of another book. Yeah. And then once I got done with those, I'd like go get a snack, find something to eat, dig in my backpack, whatever. And then I'd read one of the other books. And I just found myself kind of immersed in the worlds that I was reading. And ultimately, like, I mean, I think you know this. I think you've heard this anyway. Like I hated books when my mom used to make me do book reports every summer. Like I was walking around with books while other kids were outside playing double dutch and basketball, and I was so jealous of them. But then I started to fall in love with the stories that I was reading, and I don't know. There was knowledge that felt like I was getting. There was an escape that I felt like I was getting, and then that just continued as I got older. And I read all over the place now. Like there's not a. Romance is probably the only thing that I don't read, but I told that to somebody last week, and they were like, that's because you ain't found the right one for you yet.
That person might not be wrong. I might agree with that person. I also say this as a person who does not read a lot of romance, but you and I share a couple of favorite books. Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's Chain Gang All-Stars. Love that book. Ilyon Wu's biography, Master, Slave, Husband, Wife. I mean... like that, both of them just fly. Book. Yes,
and
but they fly. They
through that book.
Fly. They are amazing. So, what else have you read lately that you love?
Ooh, okay. It's not a narrative book.
That's okay.
I'm reading a book called Supercommunicators right now by Charles Duhigg.
Oh, I know who that guy is. Yes,
it's phenomenal. I love it.
Okay,
but I love communication because it's part of what I right. But it's the idea that like all conversations are basically like one of 4 things, and if you understand what someone wants in a conversation, then like the chances of miscommunication actually like decrease dramatically. Such a interesting concept and way to think about conversation and how you're speaking to someone and what they're actually looking for in a given moment. Like, you know, if my wife tells me how bad traffic was, she doesn't want to hear me tell her that she should have turned her GPS on and went a different way, or that she shouldn't listen to Waze. She should just listen to me. She doesn't want to hear that. She just wants me to listen to the fact that like traffic was bad.
Right.
Like, it's just an interesting way to really think about how we go into conversations and how you get the most out of a conversation, and also honor the person you're having a conversation with to make sure they get what they're looking for as well.
Well, I mean, connection and story, right? Sorry, I'm going to put on my tiara as Queen of the Obvious for a second. Connection.
Yeah.
It's all about connecting, whether you're connecting with previous versions of Jay, previous versions of your parents, I mean, that connection is what makes this book swing, or at least and because I didn't meet you until tonight. So, I mean, I met him on the page, and this is where we're going from here. But what do your parents think of the book? Because you really wanted their attention when you were small. You really wanted their attention.
It's really funny to, I did not give my parents the book until we were like going to print. And I was like, if you got anything to say, you got to say it now.
Okay.
And, they sent me this picture. It's the cutest thing ever. It's a selfie, and they're like laying in the bed, and my mom is laying on her side, and then my dad like is popped over her shoulder, and they're both holding up a copy of the book because they started reading it together. They basically did their own like book club. It was super cute. It was super cute. But then my mom was like, "He reads too slow. I'm not waiting on him." But it was super cute. They loved it. I mean, it was cool to like. What's funny is the audiobook my parents recorded themselves. I had my parents come in and read their parts of the book in the audiobook. So that was amazing because my mom was like, I don't talk like that. And I'm like, are you sure? And then I'd be like, all right, well, do you remember what actually happened? This is what happened. And then when I came home, what did you say? I said, you better not do it again. And I was like, oh, so you do talk like that. Okay. It was cool my dad called me and he goes, man, I didn't realize how much you knew what was happening around you.
Right.
In the world, like both in the world, macro and micro, in our family,
right,
and in the base that we lived on, in our city, in our state, whatever. He's like, I didn't realize that at that young age you were really that aware of what was happening, and so it was cool to be able to like go back and have conversations with him, or even conversations with my mom about like one of the stories I tell about an unsolved murder in our family, like
right.
To be able to go back and have those conversations with them. I don't know, I don't know. It's just it was really cool. They love the book though. Apparently, I don't know if they would tell me any different, but they love the book. I think
your I'm sorry, I've only met them on the page. I think they'd totally tell you. I think they would totally tell you.
Yeah. I saw my grandma 3 days ago, and she's like, "You look like you gained weight," and I was like, "Really? That's the first thing you're gonna say?" So I'm pretty sure my parents would tell me, considering they come from that lineage.
They would totally tell you.
Yeah.
So did writing this book change you?
Yes.
Okay. How?
I think about my kids' imagination in a different way.
Right.
I think about how I even process things that are happening in my life now in a different way. Like this experience of putting a book out in the world the last 2 weeks has been absolutely insane. And so like I find myself, I haven't necessarily had the time to journal, but I find myself like leaving voice notes to myself about a feeling or a moment or an event or
That's
a
journaling.
Thought. Yeah, it is. Yeah. I also think like I hopefully was able to like do a little inner child healing and understand people for who they are and where they are. And also like, I tell a story in the book about a kid I went to high school with who said some very racially charged things. And, it wasn't until I actually had a conversation with legal from the publisher, and I didn't have that person's name in there. I had that person's name in there actually. But the lawyer from the legal team was like, "Hey, just want to have this conversation." And I was like, "Well, he said it, and that's what he said."
Right.
And he was like, "Yeah, but do you think he grew up to be that person?" And I don't know. And so it made me realize that like, oh, I want to give grace to someone who learned something at home and then maybe grew up and realized, or somewhere along their journey, they realized like, oh, I was being taught the wrong thing, or I was in the wrong environment, and maybe they've changed and become a completely different person. So I think there was also a grace that I was like learning to give people in my past.
Yeah.
And as we move through into the future.
You're also involved with AMFAR. You're on the board of AMFAR, right? And I'm wondering if we might get something about your uncle at some point. Now that you've written a book, now that you've got one book behind you, might there be something? I mean, or there could be a different form of art about your uncle, but it seems to me that might be...
Yeah. It's the one story I wish I would have put in the book.
Okay.
I will say that. I have an uncle who died of AIDS in 91. So kind of at the height of the epidemic. Tons of confusion, tons of misinformation on all sides. Religious.
It was bad.
News,
it was really bad.
In the hospitals.
It was
like,
so
there's
bad.
just so much information. And a family that didn't understand and didn't talk about it.
Right.
And I was a 9-year-old boy at the time. And that uncle, my uncle, Corky is his nickname, was full of life. He was the most amazing. He's a professor, and he lived in the Bay Area. And anytime you came to the Bay, he wanted to show you everything from the submarine that's still sitting there, that's been there forever, to you had to freeze and take the ferry to go over to the prison, to the Rock. What's the prison? Alcatraz. Thank you guys. Everybody had to freeze on the ferry to go to Alcatraz, and he wanted to walk you through all of it. And he was just the most amazing person. I mean, he would spoil me to like no end. And then fast forward, all of a sudden he's sick and he's laying in this bed and he's a completely different person than the uncle that I knew. And there was no understanding of what it was. So, and again, like a 9-year-old brain trying to process that. Right?
It's a big switch.
It's a big, big switch. So I do wish I would have written about that in the book, but I do hope that I find a way to honor him someday.
Okay, fair. So I also know that your tiny toddler daughter has an invisible friend.
Multiple.
Oh, I only knew about the one,
Oh my
Jack.
God.
What do you mean
Jack
she has?
is-
When did the multiple show up?
So she has 20 cousins.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, but they don't have names. It's just her 20 cousins. So
Okay.
basically one day she comes she like comes around a corner and she's like, I have to get ready. My cousins are coming. And we have family in Northern California. So I thought maybe my mom had said something that like our family was like some cousins were coming down, but that wasn't the case. She was like, I was like, well, what cousins? And she said, all of them. And I said, well, what are their names? And she said, the 20 cousins. And I was like, what? And she goes, yeah, all 20 of my cousins, they're coming. So I have to get ready. And so I guess they came actually. I don't know if they actually came or not. But she does have an imaginary friend named Jack who we often have to clean up after. Mm-hmm. And that's been pretty amazing. Jack is written on a wall. Jack has poured water all over the floor, or spilled water on the floor multiple times. Jack has taken scissors and cut the fur off of a bear and left the fur in a pile because apparently the bear wanted a haircut. Yeah, Jack is mischievous in our house. But again, like, I don't know how I would have thought about parenting a kid with an imaginary friend had I not gone through this process of writing this book. Now I'm like, I want Jack to stop messing up my house. But I also want her to have this imagination that runs wild and reckless.
Yeah. I haven't met your kid, but wild and reckless imagination sounds pretty great.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing what you can do with that.
Isn't it crazy?
You can write books.
Yeah. It's wild.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jay Ellis, the new book.
Thank you.
Did everyone have an imaginary friend, or is it just me? You have an imaginary friend too?
Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. You know what? You can come tell us all about it. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.